that song, but I have bad memories of it from COVID. They would play that song as a joke during COVID to give us clean hands. I don't know. But I love the song. It's awesome. Good-looking crowd this morning. Well, most of you. Most of you look really good. So we will be continuing our journey through the book of Mark. I'm a little disappointed to find out they finished Ezekiel before we finished Mark, but that's okay. We're almost there. We've got plans. We can see the light at the end of the tunnel. We are in Jesus' last week on earth. We know what's coming. We know where we're heading, but I don't want us to miss anything along the way. So as we review where we've been, there's a little discrepancy throughout scholars about some of the days of the week. We're going to kind of go through them. On Sunday, Jesus arrives on what we call the triumphant entry. It was a messianic entry on a donkey with a crowd surrounding him, shouting, "Hosanna, Hosanna." There are some who try to claim that was on Monday, but there's really no evidence for it. On Monday, we see him cursing the fraudulent fig tree, and we see him cleansing the temple and then teaching at the temple. Some want to put that on Tuesday, but again, there's just no good evidence for that. We've spent the last several weeks on Tuesday. Tuesday was a big day. We started out Jesus explaining the fig tree, explaining forgiveness, explaining how to pray. Then he got confronted about his authority by the religious leaders. And then they tried to trip him up, tried to trick him, wanting to find some way to take him to trial. Gets through that, teaches at the temple, and then leads the disciples through the Olivet Discourse. So that should wrap up our Tuesday. And the events today, some believe they're on Wednesday because of where Mark puts them. We're going to discuss that because others say that Wednesday is kind of a silent day. That's part of what we're going to get into today. Another thing we're going to talk about today is we're going to uncover that confusion. But we also know Jesus is there for Passover and for the Festival of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We're going to talk a little more about that and why that's significant. And then we're going to talk about 3 significant events that take place in our passage this morning. The first is the plot to kill Jesus. Why do they want to kill him? Why is their timing when they want to kill him significant? Second, a very bold, brave act of devotion that we see this morning. And third, the start of his betrayal and what led to that. So those are the 3 things we're going to discuss in addition to some cultural and historical significant things. So as we get into it, let's turn to Mark chapter 14. And as you turn there, you realize we only have about 2 chapters left in Mark. So we're getting there. Getting there. Chapter 14, starting at verse 1. It was 2 days before the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. The chief priests and the scribes were looking for a cunning way to arrest Jesus and kill him. Not during the festival, they said, so that there won't be a riot among the people. While he was in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured it on his head, but some were expressing indignation to one another. Why has this perfume been wasted? For this perfume might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. And they began to scold her. Jesus replied, "Leave her alone. Why are you bothering her? She has done a noble thing for me. You always have the poor with you, and you can do what is good for them whenever you want. But you do not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body in advance for burial. Truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. And when they heard this, they were glad and promised to give him money. So he started looking for a good opportunity to betray him. Lord, we thank you this morning. We thank you this morning for your grace and mercy in allowing us to gather in your name. We thank you for your word. And Lord, as we get into your word this morning, I ask that you help your word find its roots in our heart. Help your word grow in our heart and help us react to you in the way this woman did. Help us react to you in a way that's fully selfless, fully devoted, where we give all of our emotion, all of our life, all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our mind, all of our strength fully to you. Lord, we thank you again for all you do and even more so for who you are. In Jesus' name, amen. So we finished the heavy lifting of the Olivet Discourse last week. Sorry, I know you guys were looking forward to some more end times discussion. You probably still have some questions. That's okay. I still have some questions. I'm sure the disciples still have some questions. It's okay. We're not always going to understand everything fully as we go through it. The one thing we can take away, though, is we know that we're not just supposed to sit idly and wait. We're supposed to be alert. We're supposed to be awake. And we're supposed to be doing the work he gave us while we wait. Now, according to Matthew's version of the events, as soon as the Olivet Discourse ended, Jesus reminded the disciples yet again that he was going to be betrayed, killed, and crucified. Mark leaves that portion out, but does transition from the Olivet Discourse to a secret, covert gathering of the religious leaders. So let's take a look. Verse 1, it was 2 days before Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. The chief priests and the scribes were looking for a cunning way to arrest Jesus and kill him. Not during the festival, they said, so there won't be a riot among the people. All right, so there's a lot in these two verses I want to make sure we have a good understanding of. It's very important for the context. First, let's talk a little bit about what Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread is. Passover is the biggest festival among the Jewish community. At that time, the city of Jerusalem had about 50 to 100,000 or more people in it. That would swell to upwards of 1 million during Passover because people would come from all over the Roman Empire to come to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. Passover was a feast that celebrated the freedom, the emancipation of the Jews from Egypt. And it had some political undertonings to it. The people thought it was a great time that the Messiah would come back. And if they'd already beaten Egypt in the past, they could beat Rome now. So they would get really excited this time of year as they'd start to celebrate. Their political feelings would start to bubble up a little bit. They would start to really feel their nationalistic roots start to bubble up a little bit because the Passover was very significant. Now, in addition to all the Jews that would come, Rome knew that it was a significant event. They didn't appreciate it because it wasn't a Roman event, but they knew people were coming from everywhere. So they would put extra security in the streets during this time too. In fact, Pontius Pilate would arrive and he would make sure that all the guards were where they should be and everybody was where they needed to be. Outside of the crowds and the politically charged atmosphere, Passover actually celebrates an atonement. It celebrates, if we look back to Exodus, Moses had showed up in Egypt to free the Israelites. He had gone to Pharaoh multiple times. Let God's people go. No. And there had been plagues. There had been frogs and locusts and all these plagues. Well, finally, God said, this is going to be the last plague. Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, look, let God's people go or every firstborn is going to pass away at night. And then he went to the Jewish people, the Israelites, and he said, here's what you're to do. You're to find a lamb. You're to sacrifice that lamb. You're to take that lamb's blood and you're to put it over your door. That way, when this plague comes, you'll be passed over. Hence the term Passover. So the Passover lamb became looked at as an atoning thing. The blood of the lamb freed you, is how they looked at it. Definitely keep that in mind. We will come back to that. The Feast of Unleavened Bread immediately followed Passover. It would start the same day Passover ended. It had its roots in the escape from Egypt as well. It was unleavened bread because they didn't have time to make bread with yeast in it. And it came to also symbolize God's provision while they're in the desert, the provision of the manna, which also was unleavened. Leaven essentially is yeast, and by New Testament times, yeast had become associated with sin or evil. So they would go the whole week of this festival, and it was purging themselves from sin or evil by not allowing yeast into their lives for that week. So very symbolic couple of weeks of celebration there. What we can take away from that is, like they kept yeast out of their body, we should definitely keep our sin out of our lives, since that's how they represented it. So we've got a good view. Everybody's in Jerusalem. The Romans are on high alert. The zealots are ready. People are looking for the Messiah. People are in a religious fervor. They're in their political fervor. They're ready to celebrate the two most important days, but these are also very charged events. Understanding that's going to be kind of important because we try to unpack why the high priests and religious leaders, A, are wanting to kill Jesus, and why don't they want to kill him right now? So first talk about why they want to kill him. Well, this is a plot line that's been going on since I think around Mark 3, where they first start to meet together to try to find a plot to kill him. Jesus was incredibly disruptive. He disrupted their way of life. He caused them to lose face. He caused them to lose influence. Jesus is very disruptive in our lives today, too. Jesus doesn't want you outside of his realm. He doesn't want you doing things that he doesn't approve of. He'll disrupt your life very quickly. But in their particular case, Jesus was doing things that were so disruptive. He was healing on the Sabbath. He was touching lepers. He was talking to Samaritan women. He was doing things that were so far outside of what they thought was right that it was turning their world upside down. He didn't elevate their man-made rituals. He didn't celebrate their traditions the same way they did. Somewhat made them look bad. But also his influence had grown. The crowd was following him. The crowd was following as they would try to trick him and fail. The crowd was following as he would get the best of them. He was causing them to lose influence. And if they lost their influence over him, they would lose power. He's disrupting their seat of power. They felt threatened. Then there's the miracles. There's healings, but then there's the other miracles, the miracles that made them feel very threatened, very disruptive. Not only was he casting out demons, healing the blind, raising the dead, he claimed authority over sickness, evil, even death. He even claimed authority over sin. Remember, he told the young man, your sins are forgiven. This is incredibly disruptive. Only God himself can do these things, and he's totally throwing their political aspirations, their power up in the air. He's just totally disrupting everything they're wanting to do. They've got to figure out a way to get rid of them. Here's the thing. If Jesus was just a good teacher, if he was just this nice guy that hugged kids and petted sheep like we see sometimes, there would have been no plot to kill him. But he's doing everything he can to not behave the way they think he should behave. He wasn't just sitting quietly by and going, okay, come here, let me teach you this nice little cute lesson. He was very disruptive in their lives. So you're saying, well, that's great. Why not kill him right now? You know where he is. You've got the opportunity. Everybody would see that you're still the ones in power. Why not just go ahead and take care of it, right? But they claim, no, not during the festival. Well, there could not have been a worse time for them to try to kill a popular teacher. Remember, he's popular. He's drawing crowds. There's political unrest. People already don't like Rome. They're already uncomfortable with their religious leaders. There could not have been a worse time, because if they try to execute Jesus right now, the people who follow him are going to rise up. There could be riots in the street. And if there's riots in the street, Pontius Pilate calls on more Roman guards, and there's a legion in the street. And Rome puts their thumb down that much harder on the area. They had to find a way, but it couldn't be now. It couldn't be now. Not during the festival. Not when everybody's here. God doesn't care about their timing. He doesn't care about our timing. God has a plan, and it's all about his timing. You see, while it's the worst possible time for them, it's a fulfillment of prophecy, and it's a fulfillment of the entire Passover that Jesus had to die at this time. We talked about the significance of the Passover lamb. There's one pure, unspotted, unsinned person that's ever walked earth. He was what was necessary to atone for our sins. For him to die on Passover met God's plan. God didn't care about their plan of not having trouble. God had his plan. Sometimes, as disruptive as Jesus can be in our lives, the fact that he doesn't let us just get away with things, the fact that he challenges our way of thinking, that he interrupts our comfort, that he keeps us from getting complacent. Sometimes we don't always want to honor and acknowledge him either. When that happens, make sure we check our hearts. Make sure we look at the man who lived perfectly for us. Make sure we look at Jesus for what he did and know that he is going to disrupt us. He's not going to just let you live this complacent, happy, soft, easy life. He wants more from us than that. Moving on, it says, while he was in Bethany, in the home of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured it on his head. This is an amazing act of love and worship, but it goes much deeper than that. Before we get to the heart of the matter, before we get to what she does here, notice it's in Bethany. That's important as we decide, as we unpack some of this. We know Jesus was staying in Bethany at this time. Notice the dinner party is being held at the home of someone called Simon the leper. Now, that's not a WWE name. That's not how they announce him. That would have been a differentiation. That would have been how you determined which Simon you're talking about. Simon was the most popular name in that area at that time. That's why we have Simon Peter. That's why there was Simon the Pharisee. This is Simon the leper, which indicates at one point Simon had leprosy. I say at one point because they wouldn't have been at his house dining if he still had leprosy. I believe, it doesn't clarify this, but I believe Simon was probably a leper that Jesus healed and was having him at his house to celebrate, to show, this is the man who healed me. No proof of that other than it just makes sense. Jesus is dining at the house of someone who had leprosy. Now, the next thing I want us to look at is what some view as an alleged conflict between Mark and John. John has the same scenario take place in John chapter 1, but he seems to indicate that it took place on the Saturday beforehand. It says 6 days before, Jesus arrived in Bethany and they had this dinner. Mark seems to be indicating that it's 2 days before, so that it would be on Wednesday. Let's see if we can make sense of that. I read a lot of things, and some of them I thought were pretty bad, but I don't think it's as complicated as some of these people were making it. First of all, as we read through it, we realize both are taking place in Bethany. Both are taking place with the same people. I think that what we see is that Mark has taken a little bit of liberal. He's been a little liberal with his chronology. What I mean by that is Mark's more interested in the literary phrase, the theme that he's trying to do here, than he is in getting it exactly to the pinpoint time. John is more interested in having it at the exact time. That doesn't mean anything's different. Mark starts out talking about the meeting of the religious leaders. Then he talks about this encounter, which leads back to the meeting of the religious leaders with Judas. It's a classic Mark and sandwich that we've seen about 8 times so far during Mark. I know, don't talk about sandwiches, we're about to eat. It's okay. But it's classic the way Mark writes his book to do that. So I don't think that this is really the discrepancy that people want it to be. I think they just wrote their books, their accounts, differently from a literature's perspective. Other than that, you'll see that Mark and John read almost identical. I'll also say this, the other thing I think may hold true is that we know Mark's account isn't as eyewitness as John's. Mark may not have cared about putting it the exact date. John was there and wanted it at the exact date. So basically, Mark's account's not strictly chronological. Some suggest these are two completely separate events. To me, that doesn't hold any water because there'd be no real purpose having two anointings. There's no real contradiction. So the next question you might ask then is, so we're at Simon the leper's house. It's Saturday or Wednesday, whatever, and Jesus is sitting there dining, and it says a woman comes in with an alabaster jar. So who is this woman? John tells us in his account that it's Mary. Now again, like Simon, Mary is a very common name. But John tells us which Mary. He says it's Mary, whose sister is Martha and his brother is Lazarus. We know they live in Bethany. We know from John's account that Jesus spent time with them in Bethany. We know that Mary had witnessed some amazing miracles, including the raising of the dead of her brother. So she probably had a pretty close affinity for Jesus. We also know that she would sit at his feet and listen. There's a whole account in the Bible of Martha, her sister, getting upset because Martha's doing all the work while Mary's sitting at Jesus' feet. Mary was very, very devoted to Jesus. Now, I will say this, unlike the disciples, we're going to see she understands something Jesus has said that they still don't quite understand. We'll get there. There is a similar story that we've looked at before in Luke chapter 7. Don't get those confused. The woman in Luke chapter 7 was in Galilee. The woman in Luke chapter 7 isn't identified by name. It's a beautiful, awesome story, but it's different. That woman is overwhelmed by her sins being pardoned. That woman is overwhelmed by Jesus' mercy and kindness. Mary's adoration seems to be more just pure adoration for who Jesus is. She knows him. She's dined with him. She's sit at his feet. She's his friend. Remember when he got there, when he raised Lazarus, Mary's the one that spoke to him and said, if only you had been here, he wouldn't have died. Mary believed. Mary has come to this passage and is completely and totally focused on Jesus. Our account in Luke, the lady was a little more focused on what he had done. Mary's more focused just on who he is, which is incredible. All right, finally, let's talk a little bit about the alabaster flask. Alabaster flask would be a type of jar that you'd put things in that you wanted to preserve. These fine perfumes would be saved there so they wouldn't lose their scent, they wouldn't lose their power. This says Mary broke the flask and seems to have poured all of it on Jesus. This would have been deep devotion. This would have been pure selfless. Mary didn't care in that moment how much that jar cost. She didn't care about the perfume. She didn't care how long she had had it, where it had come from, the history of it. None of it mattered other than to pour it on Jesus and just to worship him. What an act of just pure unselflessness, an act of love. Mary has humbled herself in a way that's just amazing. We should look at what she's done and just kind of be in awe of it because of just how humble she is. But of course, some people had a problem with it. Some people didn't like it. But some were expressing indignation to one another. Why has this perfume been wasted? For this perfume might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. And they begin to scold her. Well, in John's account again, he tells us the primary person who has a problem with Mary's actions. And that was the one that carried around the money bag. That was Judas. And Judas's actions, Judas's problem wasn't with Mary, it was with Judas. Let's talk about that. He saw what Mary was doing. He's the one that says that could have been 300 denarii. And we think about 300 denarii and we don't know what that means. We think that's $300. That's pretty expensive. A denarii was 1 day's wages. So if you made $100,000, it's $1,000. So 300 denarii is a significant amount of money. It's not chump change by any means. Judas sees that and is immediately calculating dollars. He's not thinking spiritual value. He's not thinking about Jesus at all. He's thinking dollars and cents. But let's be honest. Judas's indignation had nothing to do with the poor. Not a bit. Judas and others proposed that maybe Mary should have sold the perfume and given it to the poor. John gives us an answer to this. John says, he said this not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief and had the money box, and he used to take what was put in it. Judas wasn't concerned about the poor at all. The only charity Judas was concerned about was Judas. Judas saw this 300 denarii being poured on Jesus and thought, that's 300 denarii that could be in my pocket. I could say it went toward the poor and put at least 200 denarii in my pocket. Out of his own ungratefulness, out of his own selfishness, he very smugly and aggressively scolds Mary. How dare you, Mary? We could have used that money. Well, two things to consider. First, is he in the right to scold Mary if she was doing something wrong? We'll get there. And second, does he have a point at all? Should she have put the money toward the poor instead of pouring it on Jesus? Well, let's see what Jesus says. Verse 6, leave her alone. Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. Right away, Jesus comes to Mary's defense. Leave her alone. Why are you scolding her? What she's done is beautiful. She's loving me. She's serving me. Jesus knew Mary's heart, but he also knew Judas's heart. He knew why he was so indignant. He knew Judas didn't care about the poor. Jesus immediately came to Mary's defense. So Judas's reaction was out of line, even if Mary was doing something wrong. He should have went to Mary in private or Jesus in private, not try to scold her in front of everybody to try to make himself look good. Judas cares about Judas. So back to the other question, though. Even if Judas is wrong about his motives, even if Judas is looking to steal, does he have any kind of point? Should this 300 denarii been given to the poor? Well, again, let's see what Jesus has to say. Verse 7, the poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want. But you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Well, first of all, people have read this flippantly, and they think Jesus is trying to dismiss the poor. You'll always have the poor. That's not what he's saying at all. In fact, he's quoting, if you're on our reading plan, he's quoting Deuteronomy 15. For there will never cease to be poor people in the land. This is why I am commanding you, you must willingly open your hand to your afflicted and poor brother in your land. Jesus repeats God's command. You'll always have poor. You should always take care of them. In fact, there were laws written into their customs, or laws written into the early Bible in Mosaic law, where if you had a field, you didn't plow all of it. You left some for the poor. Or if you had a poor person that needed to borrow money, you loaned it to them, but you didn't charge them interest to make it worse. So of course, Jesus says you should take care of the poor. I mean, think about Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats, what you did for the least of these. It's also fulfilling the second greatest commandment, which is love your neighbor as yourself. So if we can say all that, then surely maybe we should have considered giving it to the poor, except Jesus says, you will not always have me. He was standing in front of her, knowing it was his last few days. And what is the first? We talked about that being the second great commandment. The first greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all of your mind, all of your soul, and all of your strength. That's exactly what Mary is doing here. Mary is giving everything she has to Jesus, unselfishly, expecting nothing in return, honoring him with what she has. There's nothing wrong. In fact, we're supposed to, we're told to give to the poor. But we're also told to worship God. We're also told to serve Jesus. We're also told that our greatest commandment is to love him with everything we have. So Mary's completely in the right here. She's showing the ultimate amount of devotion. She sees the situation. She's been listening. As she sat at Jesus' feet, and she's heard him say over and over, I'm going to be given over to the leaders. I'm going to be beaten. I'm going to be shamed. I'm going to be killed. And I'm going to rise again. We've heard that 4 times in Mark now. The disciples don't hear it. They've got cognitive dissonance. They can't process it. They've accepted he's the Messiah. They know he's great. They know how powerful he is. But they can't wrap their brains around it. Sometimes we do the same thing. If we can't understand it because it doesn't make sense in our train of thought. But Mary had been listening, and Mary understood. She knew Jesus' time was short. She came purposely. She brought with her this expensive oil and began to anoint his body with it. At that time, when you would lay someone to rest, in order to help the body decompose, help eliminate some of the smell of the decomposition, they would pour perfume and oil on the body. But Mary didn't want to wait. She wanted to honor Jesus while he was still alive. She didn't want to wait till after the fact. She loved him. She loved him for who he was, for what she had seen him do, and for who he had been in her life throughout all of this. Now, this is something that's gone through my mind a lot this week as I prepared for this. Kind of go to imagine with me, okay? Think about the fact that at this time, they didn't have showers. They didn't bathe every single day. They were outside. It's only a few days. And there was an excessive amount of this perfume poured all over Jesus. I imagine it's probably the smell probably lingered in his hair, probably lingered in his beard a little bit. Maybe it lingered on his clothes a little bit. Do you imagine that her act of devotion might have still radiated in his nose as he's hanging on the cross with his smell still in his hair? As he's taken the beating for us, and he realizes how much Mary had just given for him, as he can still smell this expensive perfume on his body. Her act of devotion would have still held with him for days. The smell would have lingered in a positive way. It would have reminded Jesus of what Mary had done. Jesus said Mary will be honored. Not only is what she done great, not only did it remind him the whole time, he says she's going to be honored for what she did. Verse 9, truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. Can you think of a higher honor? Whenever the gospel is preached, what she has done is going to be talked about in her honor, in memory of her. Here we are 2,000 years later, and as we're preaching the gospel, as we're talking about Jesus making his way to the cross, we're still talking about this event that happened at that dinner party with that 300 denarii bottle of perfume. We still tell Mary's story. We honor her act of devotion. We look to it as an example. Mary listened, she understood, she responded. Are we listening the same way Mary listened? Or do we have that cognitive dissonance? When Jesus says, go do this, do we go, I don't think that's really what you're saying, Jesus. I think maybe what you mean is that I should do something different. Or when he says it, do we listen? When we turn to the Bible and we read things like, go into all the world and make disciples, do we think, I really probably should, donate to a missionary somewhere, which is great. But are we missing him telling us to go talk to our neighbor? Are we missing him telling us to go talk to our brother, our sister, our friend? Are we missing it because of cognitive dissonance? Because he's not saying what we want him to hear? Or are we like Mary? Are we hanging on his every word and giving everything we've got to him in pure, unselfish devotion? Mary had a pure heart, a heart that loved Jesus, a heart to serve. The problem is Judas's heart wasn't pure, wasn't clean, and was focused on Judas. Judas had corrected, scorned, and spoke harshly to Mary out of his own greed. But now the tables have turned. Jesus corrected Judas. Leave her alone. What she's done is a great thing. She has gotten me ready. She's anointed me. Now Mary's the one being praised, and Judas is the one being put in his place a little bit. He doesn't take it well. He doesn't respond well. He becomes disillusioned. He becomes angry. He also realizes that he's also kind of afraid that if we start just pouring oil on everybody instead of selling it, that his cash bag's going to dry up. So he sees an opportunity. He's opportunistic. Verse 10. Remember in verses 1 and 2, we got to have a cunning way. We got to figure out how to get this Jesus. We've got to figure out how to get him. Verse 10. Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. And when they heard this, they were glad and promised to give him money. So he started looking for a good opportunity to betray him. Just like that, our two stories, as Mark intended, are tied together. They're looking for a way to get Jesus. They're looking for a way to trap him, to trick him, to try to do it under the radar. And here's one of his disciples who's got his feelings hurt, who's got his hands slapped, who no longer can get away with stealing money, going, let me help you. I can help you get him. All of a sudden, the plan starts to come together. This event pushed Judas over the edge. Immediately, for 30 pieces of silver, he sells out the man who he'd been walking with for 3 years, who he'd seen all this greatness. Everything Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John talk about, Judas had witnessed. But now, because his feelings are hurt, and because he can no longer access the treasury the way he wants to, he takes a selfish, stingy way out. Mary gave sacrificially. Judas sold his own soul out. That's the contrast Mark presents to us this morning for us to see. As we wrap up this morning, I hope that we see that while Jesus is disruptive in our lives, that we need to react to him the same way Mary did, as unselfishly, as fully devoted as she did. She planned this ahead of time. She didn't just show up spontaneously. He's disrupted the lives of the religious leaders. He's turned their world upside down. He's disrupted Mary's life. She was probably living a nice, peaceful life. She'd have eventually mourned and moved on, but now she's seen so much. He's defended her. He's raised her brother. He's disrupted Judas' life. He took him from what he was doing and shown him everything. Judas was standing there when Peter said, "You're the Messiah." Judas was standing there when Jesus healed the blind man, when he cast out the demons. How did he react in the wrong situation, though? When Jesus disrupts our lives, how do we react? When he impacts us, do we react with grace like Mary? Do we give the devotion back to him, or do we push him away? Do we say, all that good you've shown me before now isn't good enough, like Judas did? We have a choice this morning of how to react. Are we truly listening when he's speaking to us? Are we truly reacting to him as we should be? Or is our heart fully devoted to him? These last few chapters, we talked about the coin and whose image was on it, and to give to him that which has his image. Over and over, what's the greatest commandment? To give to God with all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our mind, all of our strength. He wants all of us. He wants your 300 denarii jar of alabaster oil, whatever that is in your life. He wants you to give it to him. Because I promise you, Mary doesn't regret it. Giving it to God has so much eternal reward, so much eternal. We talked on Wednesday a little bit about crowns and doing good and receiving crowns in heaven. Mary was not thinking a bit about a crown, but don't you know that earned one? Mary was thinking in that moment, I love Jesus. I know he's told me he's about to die, and I need to do something for him. Do we love him for what he is, or for what he does, or do we love him for who he is? Or both? As we wrap up this morning and get ready for our fellowship with each other, keep that in our mind. Keep Mary's act as a pure act of devotion in your mind when she could have reacted so many other ways. Lord, we thank you this morning. We thank you for the example given by your servant, Mary. We thank you for the blessings that you pour into our lives that we don't always deserve. But we thank you for disrupting us, for disrupting our comfort, for disrupting our selfish will, for challenging us to behave in ways that we wouldn't normally do, for drawing us closer to you, which sometimes makes us leave things behind that we don't always want to leave behind. But you call us to do that. Lord, I challenge each of us in this room. Lord, I want you to help us find our alabaster jar, whatever that is that we're holding on to for something special. And let us pour it out for you. Let us serve you with a purely devoted heart like Mary did. Lord, if there's anyone in this room this morning whose heart's aching for you and doesn't know what to do next, I ask you just draw them to you. Let them know that you are everything that they could ever imagine and then some. You're greater. You don't meet our expectations. You supersede them 1,000-fold. We thank you for that. Lord, we thank you for all you do. We thank you for your mercy and for your grace. And Lord, as we break up and go to our fellowship, we thank you for the provision of the food, for the hands that prepared it, and we ask you bless it. Bless our bodies to your service. Lord, use us in a mighty way for your glory. In Jesus' name.